Speaking of Bayern Munich, they weren't resistant to Arsenal though. This was a very highly anticipated game, and you saw it kicking off in the subscriber chat right after. I love our subscribers. There is a lot of passion in there, and you can always tell when Bayern Munich lose because 200-300 messages quickly become 7 to 1,000 messages as the analysis kicks off. Can I just say one thing before we go into this and break down this game? It's not the end of the world. I think that is the most important takeaway here. Nothing is going to change in the grand scheme of things. Bayern Munich are going to qualify out of this league stage, probably in the top 4, maybe even still first. They are going to skip those 2 knockout stage games, which is the only thing that really matters in the grand scheme of things, getting out of this group. And whether you finish the league stage 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, or 8th really doesn't matter, right? As long as you're in that top 8. That is, I think, the one thing that I need to really point out here. And now, with that in mind, we can break down what happened at the Emirates, Stefan.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with what you said there. I think that's the most important thing here. How much does this game actually matter? And in terms of the actual real life implications of Bayern's progression through the Champions League, it doesn't really matter a huge amount. As you said, missing and this game's not a huge problem. And that's obviously a problem that the Champions League and UEFA are going to have to maybe contend with in years to come, because there certainly were a lot of games. Curiously, it all seemed to be kind of bunched together at this point in the fixture list for the big clubs, where they all kind of faced off with one another. There was Chelsea were playing Barcelona, and even like Man City versus Leverkusen. There's another one that PSG versus Tottenham maybe is another one where you have a lot of clubs who the question as to whether they actually had to go out and win these games of the week, which is certainly up for debate. But I think putting that to one side and then kind of breaking the match down at face value, I think there's a lot we can kind of take from it. For a start, it wasn't a glorified friendly. It was a game that both teams definitely tried to win. That was the impression I got from it. And I think maybe a good example of that, of how much the Bayern players wanted to win this game, was by Joshua Kimmich's comments after the match. I don't know if you saw this, but he actually said, in his opinion, PSG were actually the better team than Arsenal, and PSG have been the most difficult team they've had to face. And I was reading that on Reddit, and someone in the top comment was someone saying, Kimmich conveniently saying the team that they beat was the better team than the team that they lost to give his own team more credit, which I thought was an interesting comment. But it obviously speaks to the fact that, he was probably quite frustrated after the match, which in itself suggests that they obviously wanted to win the game, which is good because we want contested matches at this stage in the Champions League. And I do think if we then consider that it was a contested match and it was one that Bayern wanted to win and didn't win, then it becomes a very valuable match for them to take lessons from. And I think there were a lot of lessons to take from this game, I mean, look, if this was a knockout stage competition, a knockout stage tie, leaving the Emirates with a 2-1 loss wouldn't be the end of the world, So I think that also has to be taken into account. Arsenal are probably the best team in the Premier League by not a sizable distance, but a decent distance this season. They just haven't put a foot wrong. They've got the best defensive record in Europe, both in terms of league performances and cup competitions, as well as in the Champions League. That Leonard Carter goal was the first goal they've conceded in the Champions League. So a really, really good yardstick for Bayern to kind of measure their progression with. And I think the first half was a very well contested match. I thought Bayern did well to kind of deal with the opening goal. They then scored themselves, and then it felt like a match where both teams were kind of just going toe-to-toe with one another. And I think I said on social media at halftime that for the most part, Bayern had done really well. I was quite impressed with how they were kind of able to match Arsenal's intensity and control for the game. But did also note that some players were quite quiet. I thought Serge Gnabry was quiet. Harry Kane in particular was very quiet in the first half. And I thought, we need to see more from these guys if Bayern are going to kind of go on and kind of dominate this match. And it just didn't happen. Something happened at half-time. I'm not quite sure what. I don't know if it was maybe something that was said in the changing room. I don't know if it was the fact that Arsenal maybe came out the second half and felt they had a point to prove, or complacency on Bayern's point of view, or maybe just tiredness. But it felt to me like when the first half was very well contested, the second half was one which Arsenal just kind of blew Bayern away. And maybe not in the kind of traditional sense of like outrunning Bayern or constant open play attacks, but as we've kind of talked about, and I'm sure you've kind of teed up a quote from one of our subscribers, it was just this kind of relentless attack from set pieces, and this relentless kind of ability to kind of break the game down and never really let Bayern get into a kind of rhythm of trying to dominate it or control it. And, you know, on the one hand, I was watching the game, I was kind of thinking it was almost like an old kind of playing Pokemon as a kid, where you have like one Pokemon that's got a particular advantage over another Pokemon because what type they are. And in this sense, like Bayern are a team who aren't good at set pieces, are up against a team who are exceptional in set pieces. And as such, I kind of thought, well, this is kind of worst case scenario for Bayern, but I still kind of go back to tactics, individual performances, and I've realised I've been talking for like 10 minutes straight here, so I'll let you jump in, Manu, before we kind of break some other stuff down.
Yeah, a subscriber of ours, Gautam Kahatka, I hope I said this correct. If I didn't, I'm sorry. But he, absolute bombshell of a comment. Arsenal, though, are the absolute nadir and a representation of modern football. Awful team to watch, set piece after set piece. How have we reached here where Stoke Platinum is on the cusp of winning big trophies? Ouch. But not entirely wrong. Not entirely correct either. But, with everything, there is truth in a statement. Can I break it down in saying something positive out of this? Arsenal do the very simple things very well. Capitalizing from set pieces is a strength of Premier League teams in particular, where I think physicality is far more permitted in the box than it is in other leagues. And UEFA Champions League doesn't always have the same line than the Premier League, but they do seem to handle set piece situations very similar. And a good example is the Arsenal opening goal, right? Where Neuer probably, if he had gone down in the Bundesliga, where he shoved, that goal doesn't stand, right? He stays up because he knows that, and he mentions this after the game, that he knew that he would probably not be able to draw a foul there. And so, Arsenal scored a go-ahead goal of Timber, and he doesn't look good in that situation at all. Neither did the entire Bayern defense in several other set-piece situations. Not just Neuer, but, they all run around in there like headless chicken. And that is a learnable skill, and it is something that's hurt them in the Bundesliga as well, right? We look back at the Union Berlin game, where set pieces were also a massive problem, and where Union Berlin actually did many of the same things Arsenal did to hurt Bayern Munich. Arsenal gave Bayern Munich complete control over this game. You look at all the stats, possession, passes played, where Bayern Munich were in control. Bayern Munich dominated all those things. The one thing that Arsenal didn't allow Bayern Munich, and unfortunately, this is a frustration of mine that sometimes we get these running stats, sometimes we don't. We do know that Bayern Munich do really well when they outrun their opponent. That's a big part of Vincent Kompany's football, is this creating one-on-one situations all over the pitch when the opponent has the ball, right? And which is very different than what other top teams do. Arsenal evaded that as much as possible throughout the game. They tried to get engaged in these situations. They tried to not run afoul of Bayern Munich's very aggressive style when Bayern Munich do not have control over the ball. And I think that really, really helped Arsenal in that regard, that they were sort of able to match that physicality, even though, when you look at the comments that Arsenal players made after the game, they did mention that they really did struggle with that aspect. And I think too, and this has to go into the analysis, Leonard Carl has a big chance in the 56th minute when it's 1-1, and if he scores there, this game will probably end up very differently. You know, at these upper level, at this high level of games, these moments can be really decisive. And I don't want to criticize Leonard Carl here because he's 17. He's playing what is in his young career the biggest game of his life, and he scores an absolute incredible goal to make it 1-1, right? The entire sequence of that goal, in fact, the pass from Joshua Kimmich to Olise to Leonard Carl, shows you everything that is good about this Bayern Munich team. But they weren't able to get that horsepower on the field for the full 90 minutes. And you do wonder maybe that in the second half, you know, after that Leonard Carl chance, there wasn't much that came after. And then, you know, a couple more individual mistakes, Dayot Upamecano's pass that leads to the 2-1. And then Manuel Neuer being extremely high and being out of position. You know, he plays this game. We all praise him for it. He puts himself into situations where he can be caught out. He himself doesn't like to use the word mistake. It is actually something that he works with sports psychologists on. He doesn't want to blame himself because it is something that apparently can actually bring you down. Fair enough. I am struggling to completely call it a mistake too, because it is the nature of his game, which leads to, how I'm going to describe this best, Stefan, as someone who doesn't play goalkeeper. When you are a goalkeeper and you're playing such an extremely high line, you are running extremely high risks. It's a high reward, high risk game. In that moment, if Martinelli springs loose in a one-on-one situation, I think the outcome isn't that different than if Neuer catches him 40 yards out of his goal or inside the box. With the one difference is that if Manuel Neuer catches Martinelli where he was, that leads to a quick counter situation and a moment where they can maybe get a goal scoring opportunity themselves. That is the idea of playing this high up. It looks really dumb when you get caught out, and it is a goalkeeper mistake, if that makes sense. But there is reasoning behind why you do this. When I played in the Netherlands, and this is the Dutch school of thought, you know, Van der Sar was famous for this. I played for a coach who was obviously a very different level, but I played for a coach who was very aggressive with the high line. And in my first game, he kept gesturing me to go forward and forward and forward. And at one point, I looked behind my goal. I looked behind my shoulder, and the goal was 40 meters behind me. And then he's like, "Now you're in the right place." I'm like, "I'm in the right place, but if something goes wrong, I will look really stupid." You know what I mean? And that is, I think, the best way to describe this. He was in the right place, but if something goes wrong, he looks really stupid, and that's what happened here.